타임스 뉴욕 선임 탐사보도 기자 조슈아 필립 모셨습니다. 반갑습니다.
Pleasure being here. Thank you.
작년부터 지금 1년도 채 안 돼서 세 번째 방한이신데요. 이번에는 어떤 일로 오셨나요?
So I was invited to speak at an event here called Build Up Korea, and so I'm mostly here to speak at the event and to talk to you, of course. The title of the speech I'm giving at Build Up Korea is Freedom versus Socialism, and this was my kind of thinking based on some of the discussions I had the last couple times I was here in Korea. I feel that the political discussion happening in South Korea is different from in America. You know, just not only on service politics, but I mean on more the foundations. In America, the debate around what kind of government are we, what kind of system do we have, is this idea not so much as a democracy, right? I was actually kind of shocked to find a lot of Koreans believe that they're a direct democracy. In reality, Korea is a republic. And this is important to understand if you know about the type of government you have. The founding fathers in the United States, you know, they modeled our system of government after a couple different things, right? On one side, you know, they wanted to know what a government without kings would look like. And so how do you create a government without kings? Well, they actually look to the Bible, right? So a lot of Western governments in Europe, they pull a lot from the Book of Kings in the Bible. The American system pulled from the Book of Judges in the Bible. And it was an idea of what kind of person is capable of living within a society where they're able to be free without having a totalitarian system. And then the other thing that the American founding fathers looked at was the Roman Republic and the Greek democracy. So they viewed democracy as something bad. They viewed democracy as being something that was one step away from tyranny. And the basic idea was that historically, countries that have become republics, they tend to devolve first into democracy, then into tyranny. And so a republic is what you call representative democracy. It means that you elect leaders to represent you within the democratic process. Whereas direct democracy would be that every single individual in society has to vote on everything. And the problem with direct democracy, as we saw in the Greek republics, was oftentimes you have a small clique of individuals who just vote for all kinds of things. They can have a small vote to say, should we execute this person? Should we throw this person we don't like in prison? Direct democracy very quickly leads to mob rule. And the American founding fathers, they viewed that as a type of totalitarianism. It was something they very strongly warned against, including George Washington, including all the major ones. But I want to touch on that in my speech, and then I also want to go into something else important, which again is more the topic, which is freedom versus socialism. Because the American idea emerged alongside the socialist idea. And this goes back to the Enlightenment, right? The 1700s, right? This was a time in the world, mainly within the West, where people were starting to see progress. They were starting to see new inventions and factories and kind of a new way of life emerging. And they were wondering, well, what is the place of religion? What is the place of government? What is this new man and this new world that's emerging? In Europe, they talked about the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was a moving away from religion and a moving away from tradition, because they didn't know how to integrate tradition within these emerging ideas. And so from that was the French Revolution. And from the French Revolution, from the uprising of François-Noël Gracchus-Babeuf, you had the League of Outlaws, then the League of the Just, later the Communist Leagues. And so there's a direct lineage from communism to the French Revolution. And the French Revolution, they're nothing like the American Republic. The French Revolution was the origin of socialism and communism. And what they did was they rejected not only kings, but also religion and tradition and God. The American Revolution was different. The American Revolution rejected the idea of kings, but they looked to the book of Judges in the Bible as to the type of person who would be capable of freedom. And they said that only a moral person is capable of freedom. And they also believed that freedom breeds morality, because when you're able to fail, you very quickly find that moral flaw will cause you to fail in life. And that by allowing people to fail, you have the freedom to succeed, the freedom to fail. By allowing people to fail, people are then incentivized to take ownership of themselves and make the right choices in life. The other side that they looked at, of course, was while you had the Enlightenment in Europe, you had what was known as the Great Awakening in America. And so America had a revival of religion during the same time that Europe was moving away from religion. And this breaking of the two sides of the world is what defines the modern world, where you have the communist world, which is totalitarian, and the communist world that has abandoned traditional values and religion. And then you have the free world, which is held on to tradition and held on to the idea of the goodness within humanity and the ability of people to be free if they're moral. And this created the kind of battle the modern world is defined by, which I would say you could define as freedom versus socialism.
미중 문제 전문가이시기도 한데요. 이미 지금 모든 국가들이 미중 관계를 주시하고 있고 또 거기에 영향을 많이 받습니다. 미중 패권 경쟁의 현재 상황은 어떻다고 보시나요?
So as I was describing this kind of historical battle between freedom and socialism, first between the American system and the European system, which America fought against Europe during the time of the American Revolution, right? Mostly against Britain. The modern battle of freedom versus socialism that is defining the current world is between the free world and the communist world, is now between the US-led world order and the Chinese-led world order. And so the United States represents the free world these days, the Pax Americana, the peace under America, the ideas of rule of law, right? What America has come to represent for the world represents one side of the world. The Chinese Communist Party right now is actively challenging that. And the Chinese Communist Party represents the communist world. They represent this idea that there are no human rights. There's no such thing as divine rule. The very idea that America has that, the idea of government in America is that actually our rights are given to us by God, not by government. And the role of government, that we institute government among men to protect our God-given rights. The CCP rejects that idea. And so the Chinese Communist Party would say that no, government is all. Government is what defines morality itself. And so the idea of good and evil is even defined by whether you align yourself with the Communist Party. And whatever the Communist Party does is what's deemed as right, as opposed to a moral order where the government is guarding what are, again, God-given rights, and a moral order where there's a higher morality that government itself is even judged by. That is the American idea. And so for the Chinese, for what I'm watching in the world right now, I'm viewing it through this lens a lot of times. And I think actually for a lot of people in America, it's viewed to an extent through this lens as well. The current battle taking place right now is for the battle of the type of world we're going to live in as humanity.
그럼 지금 중국 내부 상황은 어떤가요? 정치, 경제, 사회 분야, 다양한 분야에서 중국 내부 상황이 궁금합니다.
In America, a lot of politicians right now, they draw a very strong line between the Chinese people and Chinese culture and tradition and the Chinese Communist Party. And so you'll find that in America, a lot of politicians, they will criticize the Chinese Communist Party very actively now. And I think globally now you're seeing a very strong backlash against the CCP that didn't exist more than several years ago. It was really during COVID when the Chinese Communist Party started threatening a lot of countries as they called for investigations into the virus origin, that you started seeing Australia, India, Japan, other countries, even a lot of countries in Europe, Germany, taking a much stronger stance against the Chinese Communist Party. But they always do this with kind of a caveat that the Chinese people are good. They don't judge the Chinese people. And they recognize this separation between the nature of the CCP as a totalitarian, abusive force that is keeping down the people of China. Although the CCP claims it created the modern world, look at Korea. Did they have the Chinese Communist Party to create the modern world? Look at Taiwan. Did they need the Chinese Communist Party to create the modern world? The modernization in China was not from the CCP. It was from the development of the world itself over the last 100 years. And also the development of China was actually held back by the Chinese Communist Party, I'd say. It was only when Deng Xiaoping came about and lifted his boot off the backs of the heads of the Chinese people that they themselves were able to innovate and succeed. It was only because the CCP let off pressure that they were able to modernize. It wasn't from the CCP. It was from the CCP becoming less totalitarian briefly. So when a lot of people look at China right now in the United States, they view the CCP as becoming militarily aggressive. They note that, for example, the Chinese Communist Party is flying bombers into the air defense zone of Alaska. They note the Chinese Communist Party is threatening nuclear war, including, by the way, against Korea right now, although they say, Russia is the threat. They note the Chinese Communist Party is now deemed the key enabler of the war in Ukraine because it's supplying Russia. They view Russia now as being puppeteered to an extent by the CCP, and that the CCP's involvement is what's keeping the war going. They note the Chinese Communist Party being involved with Hamas and the Palestinian Authority when it comes to the war with Israel. And they note the Chinese Communist Party is now trying to enact very openly a new plan to control the entire Eurasian region. So the CCP is deemed externally as a major threat for the free world now. They're pushing back against the CCP. Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, India, United States, Canada, even NATO now, which is normally within Europe, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Even they're focusing on China now. And even they're even working against the CCP in the Arctic. And so the whole free world now is rallying against the Chinese Communist Party. But the other side of it is they recognize that internally in China, although externally it's very aggressive, internally it's very weak because the Chinese economy right now is failing. Now, the CCP, about a third of its economy was, in real estate. The real estate industry is collapsing. About another third was in manufacturing. That's collapsing. And as they've tried to save it, notably, every measure they've tried to enact has failed. And so as the CCP's economy is failing, they're still trying to become aggressively externally. And so they're threatening tariffs and all these things against other countries. They're restricting materials to other countries. Other countries are doing the same to China. But the reality for America, as former President Donald Trump noted, was that we don't need China. We're better off without them. We trade at a loss with China, as do many countries. And the CCP, of course, it does infrastructure projects. These all come with strings attached. It gets countries involved in debt traps. They can't find their way out. And when they default on the debts, the CCP gains control of the infrastructure. They gain control over key business areas. They gain control over some of the biggest economic points within these entire countries. And so they subjugate them. Countries are becoming aware of this. And so they're not getting the deals they used to get. The United States, now under President Biden, they maintained a lot of the trade war type programs, the tariffs and otherwise that Trump put into place, but they've expanded them because they recognize now that it's not even just a trade war. This is a battle between the free world and the communist world. And they recognize the CCP is actively trying to fight against the United States in this arena. It's no longer just a matter of making business deals. They're recognizing the CCP is collapsing. And as the CCP is collapsing, it's becoming more hostile. And so, for the U.S., this is how it's viewed, for the most part.
사실 좀 놀라운데요. 제가 정치 경제계 고위층들을 좀 만나봤을 때 그들은 중국이 여전히 강대국이고 또 계속 성장할 것으로 전망하고 있습니다. 실질적인 사례를 좀 더 말씀해 주실 수 있을까요?
I think many people in America might be shocked to believe that people in South Korea think that China is doing well economically, because the view in the West is very different. And this is what we're looking at. So the Chinese economy used to rely on what? Well, they relied a lot on real estate, of course. What happened to the real estate industry? Well, they got themselves stuck in a bubble. What the CCP used to do is they did mega projects. And so, they would invest money or take out loans to build mega projects. Cities nobody lived in. Roads to nowhere. Airports in the middle of nowhere. High-speed trains that go to nowhere. Now, when people look at that, they think, wow, look at these high-speed trains and everything. It was bought with debt. It was bought with debt. If you know somebody and they buy a Maserati with a credit card and they can't pay it off, would you consider them wealthy? Or would you consider them stupid? The CCP bought it with debt. And so what happened now? Well, all that debt's catching up with them. Now, I mean, it makes sense to an extent that the theory makes sense to an extent that you'd build these huge infrastructure projects, because the economic theory within China was you take money from the banks, you print money or whatever else, right? You do whatever you have to do, and you spend it on this. You spend it on construction. The money goes to construction companies. It goes down to the individuals working in those companies. They buy things, and it creates a type of circulation of money within the economy. And so it was a way of trying to get money to circulate internally within the economy. That works so long as people spend money. Once they stop spending money, that stops working. Or if they send their money outside of China, or if they save the money. And so what you had was a lot of these individuals, because maybe they didn't trust in the future of the Chinese Communist Party, they're buying foreign real estate. They're buying gold. They're buying hard assets because they don't want their money in the Chinese currency. And now you have a problem of lack of consumption in China. People aren't spending. On top of that, you have the banking crisis in China because the debt is finally catching up with them. And so that whole program is not working anymore. The real estate industry is collapsing. And so the West is watching this. They're saying, well, internally, they're not, the old way they had of circulating money isn't working. Another big part of the economy was cheap manufacturing. They do knockoff goods and otherwise. Of course, now you have Temu and Shein that are actually doing pretty dang well with this, but there's a lot of moves in the United States and Europe pushing back on that because they note a few things. Well, a lot of the goods are sold at a loss, and the cheap prices are only possible because of some of the loopholes within trade where they can sell things without paying duties. Because what they do is they do direct from factories to consumer, and so they bypass the middleman. By doing that, they bypass the normal laws that would force you to pay money for large shipments, right? And so if you buy under a certain amount of money, you don't pay duties. It's a loophole. And so other countries, not even just America, but Europe, even parts of Africa, notably, not even just America, but Europe, parts of Africa, notably, a lot of countries are talking about eliminating that loophole. At the same time, too, because of trading at a loss in the way that, the American standard of customer service is something you don't find in a lot of parts of the world, where if you don't like a good, you return it and they have to give you a full refund. A lot of countries don't do that. But if the CCP wants to compete with America, like Amazon and American e-commerce, they need to compete on the customer service level. There's an entire infrastructure that makes that possible, not even just at the business level, but even at the banking level in America, where you as a customer, if you don't like a good, you can contest the payment. If you order something in America and it doesn't come, you contest the payment, and you don't have to pay for it. The bank will even deal with the legal side of it. China has to compete with that. They don't have the infrastructure for it. And so what they're doing instead is they're putting that on the weight of the manufacturers. And the manufacturers, what are they doing? They're protesting in China. They're outside the headquarters of these companies protesting because they can't afford it. And so the system they've created with this, it's not working. Not only that, but then you have foreign investors because the CCP, one, is becoming more totalitarian, but two, because there's all these trade wars taking place, and even three, because the CCP is now so deeply involved with Russia in the war in Ukraine, and so deeply involved on the Hamas side of the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. The CCP is positioning itself militarily against the free world. That's how it's seen, at least. Now, business people can say, well, that's politics, fine. But it's politics that leads to sanctions and tariffs. It's politics that's causing a trade war. And so a lot of investors, they don't want to put their money into the Chinese economy because it's too dangerous. What happens if you invest in a company and it gets sanctioned tomorrow? So what they're doing now is they call it de-risking. They're pulling the money out of China. A lot of foreign investment right now is leaving China for India. And so a lot of the free world, they don't want their money in China anymore. And for business people, a lot of that is they don't care about politics, they don't care about military, they don't care about any of that. But they view it as unstable. It's not a safe investment anymore for them. The other side, too, is that, of course, as all these trade wars take place, you then have battles over key materials, semiconductors, rare earth minerals. The CCP had a monopoly on a lot of these, the materials needed to build these for a long time. But because now the CCP What they did was, right, they have an issue now of what you call overcapacity. They have too much surplus. And this is causing additional problems because what has happened? Well, imagine for the Chinese Communist Party, they want to compete within a certain industry, electric vehicles, batteries, solar panels, because they view this as the kind of future for the West. They think that that's what is going to be demanded in the markets, and they want to, what they would say, surpass you at the turning point. They want to get ahead of the curve. They want to be waiting for the next generation technology so they can dominate it, right? Normal business practice, fine. The problem they had, though, is because when you're dealing with a communist country and the government then subsidizes a certain industry, everybody who manufactures wants to get in on it. So what happens then? This is the problem of what in the West you would call state interventionism, where the state intervenes within the free market process, right? Classic liberalism, Ludwig von Mises in Austrian economics, they would understand this in the West, right? Classical Austrian economics would address this problem in the West. It's one of the big criticisms, in fact, of this type of economic model. What this has caused, though, is that they overproduced solar panels and electric vehicles and batteries and everything else. And not only that, but not only did they overproduce certain products within that market, but they overproduced on the material level. So they have an overproduction in steel, an overproduction in various other metals, including a lot of the rare earths. And then what happens? Well, basic economics. If you have too much supply and not enough demand, what happens to the prices? They fall through the floor. Nobody wants to buy them. And so you have to sell at a loss. Now, what happens when you sell at a loss? Well, obviously, imagine you're a baker and you're anticipating that tomorrow you're going to sell 3 times the amount you normally have to sell. So you have your people make 3 times the amount of product. Then tomorrow comes, you've hired workers to produce all these additional products. What happens tomorrow when you can't sell it? Well, it all goes bad. You can't sell it. And then you deal with the loss on all the materials, meaning all the people you hired, all the people who had jobs to do that mass production during that time period now have no jobs. Now they have no income. And not only that, but then you as the business owner have created a product you can't sell. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to dump this onto the other economies, Europe and America and so on. These countries, especially in Europe right now with electric vehicles, just as one example of this, they don't want it because they say, well, if you dump your products on our country at a loss, right, at very low prices, you will put our local industries out of business because of your mistake. And so they're not letting them do it. Because of this, the Chinese Communist Party is finding they have too much of something, they can't sell it. People in China aren't buying it because you have lack of consumption within the Chinese economy. And so what happened is this. You basically had a burst within the economy, and that burst is now contracting. And that contraction is what's crushing them from the inside right now. Now, the CCP's plan to get out of this, right, what they wanted to do to break free from this was to get into the high-tech market. The problem with that as well is that because of the trade war that has hit semiconductors and these high-tech chips, and as that has happened, that has largely derailed the CCP's ambitions to become a high-tech economy. And so now we saw recently with the third plenum and the CCP talking about its new trade model, a lot of Western investors, and you can read any of the mainstream media in the US on this, they note there's a key problem with the third plenum. The CCP, although they have laid out the ambition to break out of it, they did not provide a roadmap to it. They did not provide any solutions. And not only that, but the solutions they've already tried implementing have not been working. It has not been working. And so for investors, even if they don't care about politics, even if they don't care about wars, even if they don't care about any of this stuff, they view it as a dangerous investment, and they're not putting their money in China. Now, the other side you're having with this is because the CCP's growth and old model used to rely on the fact that it had monopolies, that it was the cheap manufacturing hub, that it had tons of foreign investment, that it was able to do these mega projects. You pull out these pieces one by one, the CCP had grown as large as it could get, what happens then is it can only contract. And as you have now diversifying markets, which is, in the West they call it diversifying the economy, right? Diversifying, which is a fancy way of saying pulling out of China. As they diversify it, it means the CCP now no longer has these monopolies. And so the Chinese economy can only contract because of this.
중국 내부에 그 지도부 내분설이 확산하고 있는데 거기에 대해서 혹시 아시는 바가 있나요?
So Xi Jinping has been in a difficult position for a long time. Of course, for a long time you had infighting between two major factions of the Chinese Communist Party. There was the faction led by Jiang Zemin, who's, of course, now deceased, right? But Jiang Zemin's faction was fighting for power for a very long time with Xi Jinping. Even Hu Jintao was under that. Hu Jintao in the West was kind of viewed as someone in power who did not have power. The Jiang faction still pulled the strings of power during Hu Jintao's reign. Xi Jinping didn't let that happen. They tried doing it to him. Xi Jinping, of course, fought back against the Jiang faction. The anti-corruption campaign in China was viewed in the West as being part of that power struggle. And even a lot of changes we've seen, for example, the Chinese Communist Party taking over Hong Kong, is viewed to an extent also as an extension of this power struggle, because a lot of the bases of finance for the rival faction were in Hong Kong, right? So there's two sides to all this stuff. There's, of course, the surface side where the CCP itself is just being totalitarian, where they're eliminating basic freedoms. But also within the Chinese Communist Party, there's sometimes other agendas at play that have to do with infighting and power struggles. For a lot of people who are in power in China, though, they also recognize that the Chinese economy is not doing well. They recognize quality of life is going down. They view this they have, of course, the lying flat movement in China where young people are no longer engaging in getting married or getting jobs or anything. They view that as a kind of quiet rebellion and a losing of hope within the system, right? People don't have faith in the system anymore. At the same time, too, they view the CCP as having made a bad move with Russia, because they anticipated Russia within 1 week was going to take over, the part of Ukraine that it wanted. That did not happen. Russia made some very bad logistical errors. They got stuck on the main road. And what was supposed to be a 1 week war is dragging on now for probably going to be years. Not only that, but the CCP, being very unhappy with Russia for not doing as well in the war as they wanted, it's making the CCP look bad. And the United States in NATO now, most of Europe, they've now deemed the Chinese Communist Party the key enabler of that war. They recognize now that Chinese banks need to be one of the main targets to deal with that. And they're talking about going after the CCP's ability to enable that war. And so for the Chinese Communist Party, remember, there are people watching this. And there are people who maybe blame Xi Jinping for some of this. And so you do have a kind of infighting over who's making the decisions on the economic policies that are not working, who is making decisions on the military policies that are backfiring, who is making the decisions on policies that have kind of turned the whole free world against the CCP because they had this, wolf warrior diplomacy. A lot of the policies have backfired, and there are a lot of people within the Communist Party leadership who recognize they've backfired. And they've recognized, whether internally or externally, although they still have a lot of influence within people they already had some favor with before, business leaders, journalists, politicians, they're beginning to burn a lot of their bridges because the interest, the personal interest that would make these ties work in the first place is starting to go away. And they're wondering now, what's the Chinese Communist Party doing?
작년에 이탈리아가 1대1로를 탈퇴했고 그 참여국들은 지금 빚더미에 올라앉아서 허덕이고 있는데 이 시진핑의 그 중국몽이 실현 가능성이 있나요?
I think Italy is making not a very good move by bringing in the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think they can look at countries like Sri Lanka, for example. They can look at countries like Bangladesh, for example. They can look at most African countries, and they can see where that goes. I mean, it's well known that the Chinese Communist Party gets countries involved in debt traps. But for Italy, it's a little different because the Chinese Communist Party is trying to entice Europe right now. The CCP wants to get into Western Europe. The CCP's strategy for Europe is a divide and conquer. And so the CCP needs to create a model. Hey, look at what we can offer you. And so very likely it will give Italy some trade benefits. But it's going to backfire, I think, in some regards, because the CCP, just as one example of this, they're trying to now manufacture electric vehicles in Italy to bypass tariffs within the European Union. And the European Union, I personally don't think in the long run is going to allow that, given the trade war taking place. But the other side, too, is this is part of the CCP strategy for Europe. So the European Union, right, the government of all of Europe, right, they actually are very much against the Chinese Communist Party right now. They're very much anti-CCP because they view their biggest threat as being Russia currently. Russia has a relative monopoly, or at least used to, over the energy in Europe. Russia's threatening nuclear war against Germany and against the UK and against other countries. They view Russia as one of the key threats because, this is a war in their backyard. And they're also worried that Russia is going to expand the war into maybe Poland or other countries as well. So for Europe, this is a big deal, right? During the recent NATO meeting with the United States and, of course, European powers, they again recognized and said publicly that China is the key enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine, meaning that Russia's ability to fight is in the hands of the CCP. Keep in mind, too, that for a lot of Western countries, Israel has religious significance, right? Israel is kind of seen as the capital of the Abrahamic religion world, right? And especially when it comes to Christianity and Catholicism. And so for them as well, the CCP inserting itself into that war, especially on the side of Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, is also seen as a direct threat against the free world and against the Western order, essentially. So in order to bypass the European Union, what the Chinese Communist Party is doing is they're going directly to individual European states. They're going directly to Belarus. They're going directly to Poland. They're going directly to Italy and France and other countries. And so for them to be able to establish a foothold in Italy is a major step for the Chinese Communist Party. Given the way that this has worked out for other countries in the Belt and Road Initiative elsewhere, though, I do think this is going to end up very bad for Italy because we've not really seen the Belt and Road Initiative work out for any country other than China so far, at least not over the long term. Let's be clear, when it comes to Italy, right? The Chinese Communist Party, when it does its Belt and Road Initiative, oftentimes it offers certain deals that will benefit maybe the CEO of a company or maybe a few national leaders, but harms the country itself over the long term. For example, again, I mentioned Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, you had leaders there declaring that they're going to wake up one day and find that they become nothing more than just a vassal state of the Chinese Communist Party. Because what the CCP does is, again, builds infrastructure, makes business deals, builds airports, and key things the country needs, right? But as soon as they default on it, because they have a predatory loan system, right? There's a predatory loan system built into it. As soon as they default on it, the ownership of these key industries within these countries shifts over to the Chinese Communist Party. And so what happens then? Well, they find that they're in a state similar to a lot of these countries where they become indebted to the CCP. And there's a saying in the United States that the debtor is a slave to the debt holder. You become a slave to the one who owns your debt. And so, this is one of the ways the CCP conquers countries without fighting. If you control the GDP products of a country, if you control the main sources of wealth that make that country work, you control that country. Because you control the jobs, you control the livelihoods, you control the ability to lobby the politicians, you control the policies people will vote for because the prosperity of the country is not in the country's hands anymore, it's in foreign hands. And so there are ways of conquering countries through non-military means. For the CCP, the Belt and Road Initiative is one of them. In the United States, there's a history to this, and we would recognize it. For the CCP, you might call this unrestricted warfare. In the West, they would call this Machiavellianism, right? Machiavelli would be the model for this, his book, The Prince. There are ways of conquering countries that do not involve military conquest. And what the CCP is doing is they're following the strategies of Machiavelli to subjugate countries, to conquer them without fighting. And so, yeah, the China dream is a dream for China and nobody else.
현재 미국은 좌우 진영에 상관없이 중국 문제만큼은 초당적으로 대응을 하고 있는데요. 그 이유가 무엇인가요?
I'm sure it's known that in America right now, the Republicans and Democrats don't agree on much. One of the only, especially during election seasons, one of the only issues that they agree on that is almost completely bipartisan is that they oppose the Chinese Communist Party. And this is important policy-wise because, you know, for a lot of other countries, when they look to the United States, and remember the United States has sanctioning power because, you know, the US dollar is the world reserve currency. When they look to the United States and policy, well, they look at it typically on a 4-year cycle, maybe even a 2-year cycle if you count our midterm elections. Because every 4 years, typically the policies change, right? Every 4 years, we might have a different trade policy and a different outlook and a different way of doing things. What it means when you have Republicans and Democrats pretty much on the same page on an issue, and not only on the same page of where it's at right now, but on the same page that actually there's going to be a deepening of a breaking on an issue, China, for example, it means the policy is not going to change. It means that this is now embedded within the country. And so the policy now for the United States is decoupling. And they don't call it that, they call it de-risking, but it's decoupling. And so what they want now, domestic manufacturing, they want to have deals with other countries and partnerships. And the United States is trying to break away from the control of the Chinese Communist Party because we found that we let them have too many monopolies on manufacturing, on raw materials, on investment. All those things are breaking away. And whether it's Republicans or Democrats, not only is there relative consensus on this, there's also relative consensus on the nature of the human rights abuses in China. For example, both Republicans and Democrats have now voted for the Falun Gong Protection Act. They've also voted on, again, human rights for Tibetans. They've also voted against, to oppose the CCP's slave labor of Muslim Uyghurs. They've also voted to basically recognize that the CCP is abusing its own people. And so whether it's human rights, whether it's business, it's no matter which party, they view it the same. But even further than that, they view the CCP's increasing hostilities as a trend that's going to grow larger. And so they view bipartisan that the Chinese Communist Party is a military threat, one that has ambitions to overthrow the United States as the world leader. And so they view the Chinese Communist Party against a fundamental threat to the free world itself. And so, based on that, you are going to watch on the current trajectory we're on, which is embedded on both the right and the left, no matter who wins the election. The trajectory we're on is they basically want to disable the CCP's ability to contest the United States in these areas. And so that is the bipartisan stance.